spring, 1943. Occupied France. Picture this. German fighter pilots, veterans with dozens of kills to their names, spot an approaching formation through the cold air at altitude. What they see makes them grin beneath their oxygen masks. There, lumbering through the clouds, is America's newest fighter plane, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. They already have a name for it. Fliegende Milchflasche, the flying milk bottle. And honestly, you can understand the reaction. This American newcomer weighs nearly 8 tons when fully loaded, almost twice the weight of Germany's sleek Focke-Wulf 190. It's bulky, enormous, frankly ridiculous compared to the lean, deadly machines the Luftwaffe has been flying to victory after victory. The German aces figure this bloated beast will be target practice, easy meat. Another example of American excess over European excellence. As one decorated Luftwaffe pilot would later confess, "We laughed. It was a terrible mistake." Because that milk bottle was about to be filled with 850 caliber machine guns, a revolutionary power plant that ruled the high-altitude realm, and a level of toughness that defied belief. The Germans laughed at the Thunderbolt right up until the moment it began systematically erasing them from the skies over Europe. To understand what happened, you need to understand the battlefield. By early 1943, the air war over Europe had evolved into lethal three-dimensional chess, and the Luftwaffe were the grandmasters. For years, German fighter pilots had dominated. Their aircraft, the Messerschmitt, Bf 109, the Focke-Wulf 190, were precision instruments, finely balanced, agile, deadly in experienced hands. These weren't just machines, they were extensions of a fighter doctrine built on speed, maneuverability, and individual skill. Pilots like Adolf Galland, Werner Mölders, and Gunther Roll had become legends, racking up kill counts that seemed impossible. The Luftwaffe's philosophy was straightforward. Train exceptional pilots, give them exceptional aircraft, let them hunt. And it had worked brilliantly. But a problem was brewing. The American bomber offensive was intensifying. Waves of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators were beginning to appear in German skies, attempting to bring the war home to the Reich itself. These bombers needed protection, fighter escorts that could match the range, altitude, and endurance required for deep penetration into enemy territory. Enter the American Challenger, and when it first appeared, the reception was less than enthusiastic. It wasn't just the Germans who were skeptical. American pilots took one look at the P-47 and felt their hearts sink. Picture a young fighter pilot, fresh from training, arriving at an airfield in England. He's been dreaming of flying the legendary Spitfire, that beautiful, nimble British thoroughbred that dances through the sky like a ballerina with machine guns. Instead, he's assigned to the 4th Fighter Group, and he's handed the keys to this, the P-47 Thunderbolt. His first impression? It's a truck. No, worse, it's a flying barn. The cockpit is spacious, sure, but that's small comfort when everything else feels wrong. The controls seem sluggish. The thing takes forever to accelerate. Getting it off the ground requires a runway that seems to stretch to the horizon. The pilots start calling it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, they'd claim later. But in those early days, it was because the plane's profile looked like a common milk jug. Clumsy, crude, completely wrong for air combat. Many of these American pilots had cut their teeth on nimble fighters. They understood dogfighting as an art form, tight turns, vertical maneuvers, graceful aerial ballet with lethal consequences. The P-47 felt like the antithesis of everything they'd learned, and their first combat missions did nothing to change that opinion. April 8, 1943. The Thunderbolt's combat debut over France had to be called off before any combat even occurred because the American radios didn't work properly with the rest of the formation. Humiliating. The entire fleet needed retrofitting with British equipment. When they finally did engage, the results were grim. In the first 2 months of operations, P-47 squadrons flew over 2,000 sorties. They claimed 10 German aircraft destroyed. They lost 18 of their own. The Luftwaffe pilots quickly learned the playbook: drag the American giant down to low altitude, force it into a turning fight, watch it struggle and flounder, move in for the kill. The flying milk bottle seemed to be exactly what everyone thought: an oversized, underperforming disaster. Even American pilots were losing faith. Veterans of the 4th Fighter Group openly mourned their lost Spitfires. Back in Germany, Luftwaffe intelligence officers compiled reports with barely concealed amusement. This was America's answer. This bloated monstrosity. The laughter in German officers' messes was genuine and loud. They'd faced everything the Allies could throw at them. This clearly wasn't a threat. But what none of them understood, what they couldn't see from the outside, was that the P-47 wasn't designed for their kind of fight. It was designed for a completely new kind of warfare. And the joke was about to turn very, very deadly. To understand what the P-47 truly was, you need to meet its creator. Alexander Kartveli was a brilliant Georgian immigrant who'd found his way to America and into the offices of Republic Aviation. The U.S. Army Air Corps had given him a seemingly impossible challenge: design a fighter that could take on the Luftwaffe's best and win. Most designers would have looked at successful fighters of the day and tried to build something similar but better. Lighter, more maneuverable, faster in a turn. Kartveli looked at the problem from a completely different angle. He started with the engine. Specifically, he started with the most powerful engine he could get his hands on, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. An 18-cylinder radial monster capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. And then he built an entire airplane around it. To harness that power, he needed a revolutionary turbo supercharger system. To fit that system, he needed an enormous airframe. To make that airframe work, he needed to throw out every conventional assumption about fighter design. When Kartveli presented his proposal, he reportedly said, "It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." And a dinosaur it was. Empty, the P-47 weighed nearly 10,000 pounds, fully loaded with fuel, ammunition and equipment, over 17,000 pounds. Compare that to the Focke-Wulf 190, less than 9,000 pounds, fully armed and ready for combat. This weight had immediate consequences. The Thunderbolt's climb rate was abysmal. In a traditional turning dogfight, it was hopelessly outmatched. It needed long runways that weren't always available at forward bases. By every conventional measure of fighter performance, the P-47 seemed like a failure. But Kartveli hadn't designed a conventional fighter. He'd designed something else entirely. Something the world had never seen before. And hidden beneath that ungainly exterior were secrets that would revolutionize air combat. The Germans were judging the Thunderbolt by their standards, their rules, their kind of fight. They were about to learn that the Americans were playing a completely different game. The first secret of the P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't visible from the outside. It was buried deep in the nose, hidden behind that bulky cowling the Germans found so amusing. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp wasn't just an engine. It was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering that would prove to be one of the finest power plants of the entire war. 2,000 horsepower in standard configuration, eventually pushed to over 2,800 horsepower with water injection systems. To put that in perspective, the superb Daimler-Benz engine that powered the Messerschmitt Bf 109 produced between 1400 and 1800 horsepower, depending on the variant. The R2800 was in a different league. But the genius wasn't just raw power, it was the design philosophy. The R2800 was a radial engine. Unlike the sleek inline engines found in aircraft like the Spitfire or the Bf 109, a radial engine arranges its cylinders in a circle around the crankshaft. This created significant drag, which is why the P-47 had that bulky, barrel-like nose. But it also meant something else, something Luftwaffe pilots would soon discover to their horror. There was no fragile cooling system. German pilots were accustomed to a certain pattern of aerial victory. You line up your shot, you fire your cannon, your shells tear through the enemy's engine compartment. A coolant line ruptures. Liquid spills into the slipstream. The enemy's temperature gauge spikes. Their engine seizes. Kill confirmed. That's how you brought down a Spitfire. That's how you killed a Bf 109. That's how air combat worked. The R2800 was air-cooled. There were no vulnerable coolant lines to sever, no liquid to leak. The entire engine was a solid mass of steel and aluminum that could absorb punishment that would destroy any other power plant. Documented cases exist of P-47s returning to base with entire cylinders shot clean off the engine, and the engine was still running, still producing power, still bringing its pilot home. It wasn't just an engine, it was a fortress. But even this incredible power plant had a weakness, the same weakness that limited every piston engine of the era: altitude. At sea level, an engine breathes easily. The air is thick with oxygen. Combustion is efficient. But climb to 25,000 feet, and the air becomes thin. Starved of oxygen, engines begin to gasp and wheeze. Power drops dramatically. Performance suffers. Every air force in the world understood this problem, and every air force had the same solution: the supercharger. A supercharger is essentially a pump driven by the engine itself. It compresses incoming air, forcing more oxygen into the cylinders, maintaining power even as altitude increases. The Germans used them. The British used them. The Americans used them. But they all had the same fundamental limitation. A mechanical supercharger is driven by the engine's crankshaft, which means it's parasitic. It steals power to create power. And as altitude increased, the system became less efficient. Above 25,000 feet, even supercharged engines began to struggle. The P-47's designers had a different idea. A revolutionary idea. Instead of using the engine to drive the supercharger, they would use something else: waste energy. Specifically, the scorching hot exhaust gases that every piston engine simply throws away. Enter the General Electric turbo supercharger. This system was a masterpiece of engineering complexity. Hot exhaust from the R2800 engine was channeled through ducting down the belly of the aircraft to a turbine assembly mounted in the rear fuselage. This turbine, essentially a precisely engineered pinwheel, was spun by the exhaust gases at over 20,000 revolutions per minute. Connected to the turbine was a compressor. As the turbine spun, the compressor would scoop up the thin, cold air at altitude, compress it, and force it back into the engine. The result was nothing short of miraculous. While German fighters with their mechanical superchargers began losing power above 25,000 feet, the P-47's R2800 was just getting started. At 30,000 feet, in the frigid, oxygen-starved realm where Allied bombers flew their missions, the Thunderbolt maintained its full, immense power output. Up there, In the thin air that choked other fighters, the clumsy jug transformed. It became fast, responsive, powerful beyond anything the Luftwaffe could match at that altitude. The Germans had been judging the P-47 based on low-altitude performance, where its weight was a crippling disadvantage. They hadn't realized they were being drawn into a new battlefield, a vertical battlefield that stretched into the stratosphere, a battlefield where all their advantages disappeared. And the flying milk bottle was about to reveal its second terrifying secret. If the engine was the P-47's heart, its armament was its soul, and that soul was forged in a uniquely American philosophy of warfare: overwhelming, unadulterated firepower. The Thunderbolt carried 8 M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. Let that sink in for a moment. 8. 50. Caliber. Guns. This wasn't just a lot of firepower. This was a flying artillery battery. When a P-47 pilot pressed his trigger, those 8 guns could unleash over 100 rounds per second. Pilots didn't describe it as firing guns. They called it projecting a wall of lead. The ammunition capacity was equally staggering, up to 4,000 rounds total. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 could exhaust its cannon ammunition in a handful of bursts. A Thunderbolt pilot could hold down the trigger for nearly 30 seconds of continuous fire. You didn't need to be a perfect marksman. You didn't need to place your rounds with surgical precision. You just needed to get the enemy somewhere in your sights and let the sheer volume of fire do the work. The guns were carefully harmonized to converge at a specific distance, typically around 300 yards. Anything caught in that convergence zone would be absolutely shredded. The 50 caliber round was heavy and high velocity. It could punch through armor plating. It could shatter engine blocks. It could saw a wing clean off an enemy fighter. German ace Gunther Roll, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful pilots, described facing this firepower as industrial execution. It wasn't a duel. It wasn't a test of skill. It was annihilation, and the platform delivering this firepower was nearly indestructible. The P-47 Thunderbolt was, without exaggeration, one of the toughest aircraft ever built. The cockpit was surrounded by a bathtub of armor plating. The radial engine could absorb damage that would vaporize a liquid-cooled power plant. The sheer size of the airframe meant enemy rounds could often pass straight through without hitting anything critical. But the real proof wasn't in specifications. It was in stories. Stories like that of Major Robert S. Johnson, June 26, 1943. Johnson's P-47 is ambushed over France by a Focke-Wulf 190. The German pilot is skilled and determined. 21 cannon shells strike Johnson's Thunderbolt. Hundreds of machine gun rounds follow. The canopy shatters. The aircraft catches fire. Johnson is wounded. He tries to bail out, but the damaged canopy is jammed shut. He's trapped in a burning aircraft, thousands of feet above enemy territory. In desperation, he shoves the stick forward and dives. Miraculously, the flames are extinguished by the rushing air. But his troubles aren't over. As he limps toward the English Channel, the same German pilot moves in to finish him off. Johnson's guns are dead. He can't fight back. He can only watch as the Focke-Wulf lines up for the kill. The German pilot makes multiple passes, pouring fire into the helpless Thunderbolt. Finally, out of ammunition, the German pilot pulls alongside. He looks across at Johnson, at this man who should be dead 10 times over, and rocks his wings in a warrior's salute. Then he turns for home. Johnson manages to fly his shattered P-47 back to base. The ground crew counts over 200 bullet holes. This story would become legendary. But it wasn't unique. Pilots routinely brought Thunderbolts home with horrific damage. Missing pieces of wing, engines with cylinders shot away, fuselages that looked like Swiss cheese. The Luftwaffe was used to targets that disintegrated. Now they faced an enemy that refused to die. They could pour ammunition into these American giants and watch in disbelief as they simply kept flying. As Luftwaffe ace Johannes Steinhoff said, the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead. The laughter had died. In its place grew something the Luftwaffe hadn't felt in years: fear. The P-47 was a weapon without a doctrine. In those early, disastrous months, American pilots were trying to fight the Luftwaffe's fight, trying to turn and twist with nimble German fighters at low altitude. It was a deadly mistake. But a new generation of commanders was beginning to understand the truth. Men like Hubert Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group looked at the P-47's characteristics and had a revelation. You don't send a heavyweight boxer to dance ballet. You teach him to use his power. The answer was a tactic as brutal as the aircraft itself. Boom and zoom. The doctrine was elegantly simple. Never engage in a turning dogfight. Instead, use the P-47's phenomenal high-altitude performance to climb above the enemy. From 30,000 feet or higher, prowling Thunderbolts would scan the skies below, waiting for targets. And when a target was spotted, they would attack. Not horizontally, not in a graceful curve, vertically. They would tip over and dive. And in a dive, the P-47 was utterly unstoppable. Remember that 8-ton weight? That crippling disadvantage in a climb. In a dive, it became the Thunderbolt's greatest weapon. Gravity seized that massive fighter and hurled it downward with terrifying acceleration. The P-47 could exceed 500 miles per hour in a dive, speeds that would literally tear the wings off other aircraft. At these velocities, the Thunderbolt became a guided missile. The attack was swift and devastating. A P-47 would plummet out of the sun, often completely unseen until the last moment. The pilot had mere seconds to line up his shot, press the trigger, and unleash hell. Before the enemy could react, before they could even turn to see where the attack had come from, the Thunderbolt would be past them, using its incredible speed to zoom climb back to altitude. Ready for another pass. There was no duel, no exchange of graceful maneuvers. It was execution from above. This tactical shift transformed everything. By late 1943, the strategic bombing campaign was intensifying. Waves of American B-17s and B-24s penetrated deeper into German territory, bringing destruction to factories, rail yards, and oil refineries. But the cost was horrific. Without fighter escort, the bombers were slaughtered. German fighters would swarm them, attack from every angle, send them spiraling to earth in flames. The bomber crews called it running the gauntlet. Now everything changed. The Thunderbolts, with their incredible high-altitude performance and devastating tactics, became the bombers' guardian angels. German fighters that wanted to attack the bomber streams first had to fight their way through a ceiling of prowling P-47s. And that ceiling was death. Luftwaffe pilots would look up and see them circling high above, bulky silhouettes against the sun, waiting patiently for someone to make a mistake. If a German pilot tried to climb to attack the bombers, the Thunderbolts would dive on him. If he tried to run, they would chase him down in a high-speed pursuit he couldn't win. The psychological impact was devastating. By late 1943, German intelligence reports that had initially dismissed the P-47 as a joke now identified it as a critical threat to Luftwaffe operations. The aircraft itself continued to evolve. One of the most significant improvements was the bubble canopy. The original P-47 had a razor-back design, a raised spine behind the cockpit that created a massive blind spot to the rear. In aerial combat, not seeing behind you could be fatal. The new teardrop-shaped bubble canopy gave pilots an unobstructed 360-degree view. Now, a Thunderbolt pilot could see in every direction. No more ambushes from behind. Another game-changing upgrade was the paddle blade propeller. The original propeller blades were narrow. The new paddle blade design featured much wider blades that could bite into the air more effectively. The result? Dramatically improved takeoff performance, better acceleration, and most importantly, a significantly improved rate of climb. That sluggish jug that struggled to gain altitude? Now it could climb right along with the fighters it was hunting. With these improvements, the P-47 became truly formidable. It had the visibility to see threats coming, the climb rate to position for attacks, the speed to execute, the firepower to kill, and the toughness to survive. The days of mockery were over. When Luftwaffe pilots looked up and saw those bulky silhouettes circling high above, they no longer laughed. They felt a cold knot of dread in their stomachs. The sky was no longer theirs. The American juggernaut had arrived, and it was just getting started. As 1944 dawned, a new fighter arrived in European skies. The North American P-51 Mustang, sleek, fast, and most importantly, it had incredible range. With external fuel tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something even the improved P-47 struggled to match. For most aircraft, this would have spelled obsolescence, being replaced by a newer, better fighter. But for the Thunderbolt, it was the beginning of a second life. A new calling, where its particular talents would be unleashed with even greater ferocity. Fighter bomber operations. The Germans had a word for it. Jabo, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. And they would learn to fear that word. The P-47's powerful engine meant it could carry a staggering payload, up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, a load that rivaled dedicated light bombers, plus an array of 10 high-velocity rockets mounted under the wings. This transformed the high-altitude hunter into a low-level angel of death. Unleashing hell. In the months leading up to D-Day, Allied air commanders had a mission: cripple the German war machine before the invasion began. Cut the railways, destroy the supply depots, strangle the logistics that kept German armies in the field. The P-47 was the perfect weapon for this task. Flying at treetop level, squadrons of Thunderbolts roamed across occupied France like packs of predators, hunting anything that moved. Railway locomotives, truck convoys, supply columns, troop concentrations. A flight of 4 P-47s could appear in seconds, their .850 caliber guns per aircraft ripping a column of trucks into a chain of burning wreckage. Their rockets could obliterate an armored vehicle. Their bombs could crater a rail junction or an airfield. It was in this role that the P-47's legendary toughness became its most vital asset. Low-level attack is incredibly dangerous work. You're flying directly into a storm of ground fire, anti-aircraft guns, rifle fire from every soldier with a weapon. But the Thunderbolt could take it. P-47s would routinely return to base, riddled with holes, trailing smoke, engines coughing, but flying. And their pilots were alive. There was a saying among Thunderbolt pilots: there isn't a pilot alive who wouldn't rather belly one in than bail out. They all trusted their aircraft to bring them home, no matter what. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Thunderbolts were everywhere. Over the beaches, providing close air support for the troops hitting the sand. Over the interior, hunting German reinforcements trying to reach the front. Over the roads, destroying anything that tried to move. In the brutal weeks that followed, the P-47 became the German soldier's worst nightmare. Imagine you're a German tank commander in Normandy. Summer of 1944. Your tank is one of the finest in the world. You've trained for years. You've survived the Russian front. You know your craft. But now you're paralyzed. Because if you move during daylight, you die. It starts with a sound, a distant rumble that every German soldier learned to recognize instantly. The sound of Pratt & Whitney, R2800 engines, and then they appear, low, fast, deadly, the Thunderbolts. You have perhaps 5 seconds before the storm hits. 5 seconds to abandon your vehicle and dive into a ditch. 5 seconds to pray. Then the sky erupts. Rockets streak down. Bombs tumble end over end. And that sound, the sound that haunts every German soldier's nightmares, the roar of 32 50-caliber machine guns firing simultaneously as 4 Thunderbolts make their attack run. When it's over, your vehicle is burning. Your column is destroyed. Your comrades are dead or wounded. And the Thunderbolts are already gone, racing away at 400 miles per hour, looking for their next target. This happened hundreds of times every single day. German troops developed a psychological condition. They called it Jabo fever. The sound of those engines would trigger panic. Soldiers would abandon their positions and dive for cover, even if the aircraft weren't attacking them specifically. German commanders were reduced to moving only at night, hiding by day like prey animals. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, bitterly complained that Allied air power, led by the Jabos, had made it impossible to conduct any meaningful troop movements. The statistics tell the story. From D-Day to VE Day, P-47 pilots claimed the destruction of 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, 68,000 trucks. They systematically dismantled the German logistical network, starving the front lines of supplies, reinforcements, and ammunition. The joke had become a juggernaut of destruction. But the true story of the P-47's victory went even deeper than tactics or technology. It was a story about 2 completely different philosophies of war, and only one would survive. The Luftwaffe's approach to air warfare was built on a romantic ideal. The ace, the knight of the sky, individual pilots of exceptional skill, flying precision-crafted machines, locked in deadly duels that required years of training to master. Men like Erich Hartmann with his 352 victories, Gerhard Barkhorn with 301, Gunther Roll with 275. These weren't just pilots. They were artists, warriors whose skills took years to develop and could never truly be replaced. The American approach was fundamentally different. It was industrial, systematic, overwhelming. The P-47 was the perfect symbol of this philosophy. Between 1941 and 1945, Republic Aviation produced over 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts. 15,000. At peak production, a new Thunderbolt rolled off the assembly line every single hour of every single day. This was an industrial tsunami that the German war machine simply could not counter. While German factories, hammered by constant Allied bombing, struggled to produce a few hundred fighters each month, America was burying the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of steel. And it wasn't just the aircraft. Over 125,000 R2800 engines were produced, not just by Pratt & Whitney, but by automotive giants like Ford and Chevrolet, who had converted their factories to war production. This ensured an unlimited supply of aircraft, engines, and spare parts. When a P-47 was damaged, it could often be repaired and flying again within days. When a German fighter was lost, its replacement was uncertain. The philosophy extended to the pilots themselves. While the Luftwaffe's training program withered under fuel shortages and the constant drain of combat losses, the United States built a vast training pipeline. Before ever seeing combat, an American pilot received hundreds of hours of flight instruction. They learned on training aircraft. They practiced aerial gunnery. They flew mock combat missions. By late 1944, a new Luftwaffe pilot was lucky to have 100 hours of total flight time before being thrown into combat against battle-hardened American veterans. The Americans weren't just building more planes, they were building more pilots. Nearly 200,000 of them over the course of the war. The loss of a pilot was always a tragedy, but in the American system, he was a replaceable part of a vast machine. In the Luftwaffe system, the loss of an experienced ace was catastrophic and irreplaceable. By May 1945, the verdict was clear. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had carved its name into history with blood and thunder. The aircraft once mocked as a flying milk bottle had become a legend. It ended the war with an official kill-to-loss ratio of over 4-1. It had flown over 500,000 combat sorties. It had destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in the air and tens of thousands of vehicles on the ground. Its journey from underdog to dominator was a story of adaptation, of ruthlessly exploiting strengths and accepting limitations. It was a story of technological innovation, of harnessing revolutionary engineering to conquer new frontiers. But above all, it was a story about industrial philosophy, about the reality that modern wars are won not just by tactical brilliance or individual heroism, but by the relentless, overwhelming power of mass production. Perhaps the ultimate testament came from Adolf Galland himself, Germany's general of fighters and one of the Luftwaffe's greatest aces. When asked what truly defeated the Luftwaffe, he didn't point to a single battle or tactical failure. He pointed to the sky over Germany, darkened by swarms of American fighters that could hunt his pilots to extinction without ever running short of replacements. The P-47 was the brutal instrument of that dominance. The Thunderbolt's legacy lives on. Its design philosophy, a heavily armed, incredibly tough aircraft built to support ground troops in the most dangerous conditions imaginable, has a direct spiritual successor. The Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II, better known as the Warthog, built by the same company, carrying the same name, embodying the same philosophy of overwhelming firepower and supernatural toughness. The story of the P-47 is a perfect reversal of fortune. It begins with laughter and ends with fear. It starts as a joke and finishes as a juggernaut. It's a timeless reminder that in the deadly calculus of warfare, the most underestimated weapon can often become the most decisive. The German aces who laughed at the flying milk bottle learned this lesson the hardest way possible. In the skies over Europe, between 1943 and 1945, the joke became a juggernaut, and the sky would never be the same again.